Hello, everyone, and welcome to And the Beat Goes On. We're so excited that you are with us today and tuning in. I am super excited that we have Dr. Felicia Barber with us. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And we also have on with us Brittany Stanton, our Director of Education and Assistant Conductor here at the Choir School.
Hello, everyone.
And I'm Ariana Harley Emerson, Director of Music and Operations here at the Choir School. Thank you so much for joining us. We are so appreciative that you set aside some time to join us. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you again. So, Dr. Barber, how are you doing?
I'm great. How are you? Thank you so much for having me. I feel honored. I've been watching your series, so I'm really excited to be a part of this. Actually putting my voice out there and what's happening in the choral community. So I appreciate the invitation.
The honor is truly all ours. We're so glad that that you came on. So thank you. And how are you doing in the midst of this? I mean, we've got a pandemic, we've got unrest, we've got, a reawakening to trauma within Black and Brown communities. A lot is happening right now in our world. How are you hanging in there? How are you feeling? Tell us about you.
It's been a lot. Actually, this past spring was my first sabbatical. So I'm Director of Choral Activities at Westfield State University in Westfield, Massachusetts. And I just got tenure last year.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And so this was the first time I had the opportunity to do a sabbatical. And I actually was doing some guest lecturing actually on diversity initiatives prior to getting ready to go to England. And then COVID hit and the world shut down. So thank God I was on this side of the pond before. But it really has been a time of reflection for me. And I know we'll get to this later. I actually kind of dug in and was very productive in other things that I had wanted to accomplish, which is the first thing is finishing my book, which will be out this fall. So that was the main focus of my, I guess, isolation. But as you said, there's just been so much unrest, and the issue of racism, systematic racism, has come to the forefront. And I have found, and I'm sure you have, other choral directors and other teachers reaching out to me to either speak to their classrooms. I've done some Zoom and clinicking and just kind of talking through and processing what's happening. Yes. And so that's kind of been my spring. As you said, there's just been so much.
Absolutely, absolutely. And how did you end your semester? So did you guys just cancel classes? Did you pivot to online instruction? Did you what happened?
So COVID hit right about the same time as spring break. And so Westfield State actually decided to take an extra week for spring break and then transitioned into virtual classes. And there's a lot of discussion on this fall, whether we will be completely virtual, we will be some type of a hybrid format. And I think it's moving towards a hybrid format. I have personally chosen to do virtual synchronous predominantly, and we'll see what happens from there. But that's what happened. And so a lot of the students, again, for choral music, it's such a community and it's so relational. And right now I'm currently actually working with Gordon College with the Summer Masters, and we're working through some of these same issues of trying to recreate the community that's established through choral music and doing that virtually. It's just so hard and trying to find new avenues. So that also has been a part of my spring.
Wow. So busy. Can you tell us, did the rest of the ensembles at the university did you guys do did you do any sort of virtual choir instruction? Did you guys kind of switch it over to lecture based? What did that look like?
Well, again, I was on sabbatical, but I had Dr. Abercrombie, who former Director of Choral Activities at UMass Amherst, was in, and they did some virtual work, but did not actually do a virtual performance. I think they just continued with classes virtually and then finished out the semester.
Awesome. I'm always very curious how people pivoted and
it's a lot. This summer
really
we're doing a
happened?
virtual project with the ensemble that I'm working with currently, and so for the conductors, that has been a challenge. Usually in the summer, I go through a lot of literature with them because they're of course getting teachers getting their masters. So I try to provide a lot of K through 12 literature, and usually we have like 12 or 14 pieces. And this summer we're working on 4. And
Right.
making 4 good,
Right.
and then putting on a virtual performance. So it's a big shift.
And can you tell us a little bit more about this class that you're teaching with the K through 12 literature? We'd love to hear a little bit about that.
So in the summers, I teach a choral techniques class and a choral seminar. And through the choral techniques class, I usually have 4 or 5 conductors that are the primary conductors. And they're taking this class and they work with an ensemble that's usually about 60 students. And these students are band directors as well as general clinicians. And they're all coming back and they perform in all of the ensembles, which is great. And they serve as the lab ensemble. And so with the conductors, I try to make sure that I get some information about their background, and I select music that will challenge them and something that also would be practical that they can use in the fall. And then we work through it. And so they're working with the ensemble. We have our own private lessons and conducting master classes separately. And then I teach a separate class that's kind of like a choral techniques class, choral pedagogy class. And we just go through a series of topics, everything from placing voices to adolescent voice to, I always do diversity initiatives and spirituals. So we have a range of topics that we cover throughout the summer semester. And in 3 summers, the teachers will have their masters.
Got it. Wow, that is quite a program. Congrats to you. That's a big undertaking. That's a big deal. And can you tell us a little bit about you, your origin story? Who are you? Tell us who you are. What was life like for you growing up and your musical experiences? Because I know that not many people have had the maybe opportunity to meet you, myself included. So tell us who are you and what's your origin story?
So I am the youngest of 6, and I was raised by a single mother who had 2 and 3 jobs and put herself back through school. So a lot of my drive and dedication, as well as my passion for music, I owe to my mother. She was the church musician. A lot of us for African-American community, we started in the church, and it's the same for me. My mother was the church pianist, and it wasn't because she necessarily wanted to be. The church pianist left, and she trained herself to be the pianist. My sister is currently the church organist at the same church that I grew up in. And for me, I always loved singing. And my mother, I can remember coming home from school and hearing my mother as I was crossing, like, I'm from a rural area, crossing like through people's yards. I could hear her voice bellowing, and the house was always gospel music. So there was nothing else played. I don't know what other kids were listening to, but in my house, the only thing that was being played was James Cleveland. I know Andre Crouch. So that's what I could hear. And I remember hearing her sing. And then her singing with her sisters is what some of my favorite memories in church, because they would always harmonize something different. It would always be different. And it wasn't a game, but it was just really a joy. Every time we cooked together, even until her passing, we would be singing. And so singing for me was very much a part of the community and a strong part of my development in Western New York. I'm from a little town called Friendship, New York. And I was the first of 6 to go to college, not the last, but the first of 6 to go to college. And I went all the way through to my PhD. And so my mother always pushed education, that if, you go for the education and faith. And so those are the things that kind of drove me as a child. And I always knew I wanted to do something in music. I didn't even know what I should be doing in music. I think of my background, we lost our teacher, our vocal teacher. When I was in 4th grade, we started having one new teacher after another. We couldn't retain good teachers. And by the time I got to 9th and 10th grade, we had a wonderful teacher that came in for 2 years, Janine Shelley, shout out to you. And then she moved on to another school, and then they just didn't replace the choral. So then I was filling out my own applications and getting them signed. And so for me, it really was a love for singing that I think continued to push my passion to pursue it as a degree. And my mother, I remember my senior year, I was kind of academic. And some of my teachers, I was originally going to be a lawyer, were still pushing for law. And my mother had enough kind of know-how to say, I don't care what you do, as long as you go to college. So she supported me in everything. And I think it gave me the freedom to pursue my love of music. And so I'm very grateful for that.
Awesome. Awesome. And how did you, I'm also very interested, particularly with other, Black and brown choral conductors. When did you start to experience kind of Western choral music as we know it, like Brahms, Beethoven, kind of outside of the kind of gospel idiom?
Well, I participated in all states and area all states throughout. So I had that experience. It really wasn't though until I got to college that I really got an understanding of the art form and understood and actually began to study music and Western European music, which is again what we're presented with for the most part in college. So it really wasn't until undergrad, and my undergrad is from ORU in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And my undergrad is actually a vocal performance because I was so, I guess what behind the ears, I didn't even know what to major in. I just knew I loved singing. And so my first degree is vocal performance and then subsequent degrees, music education and then conducting. So that was the start of my path. And then it really, I think choral music solidified for me in my master's program with Peggy Detweiler at Westfield University. And she's fantastic and such an elegant conductor. And for the first time, I think I saw myself as a conductor as opposed to a singer. I really, up until that point, I was still thinking, do I want to be a performer? Maybe I want to do theory. I hadn't found the footing. And it wasn't until I got through that master's program that it solidified really the direction of my life. And then I began to teach in Nashville. And I taught there for several years in Williamson County and built a choral program. And it was like the light went on and I found a home because there is a part of me that loves the scholarship. There's a part of me that loves the performance practice and the research, and then also being able to be a part of the performance and going through the process with students. I enjoy all aspects. And so it was kind of like I finally found my home.
Awesome. Awesome. And can you tell us, what was it like when you got to Florida State with Dr. Thomas? Tell us about that experience.
It was, well, I want to tell you a little story before that. I actually, I had two experiences with Dr. Thomas prior to attending Florida State. So in 2006, I took a group of students to one of the programs, the festivals that they do in New York City, and he was the guest conductor. And my students were in love with him. And it was just amazing to see how he transformed the ensemble and all of these kids. So that was my first experience. And then the second experience was a summer festival that they do in Tennessee. They do a Tennessee Arts Academy and they always bring in clinicians. And he was not even the conducting clinician that year. He was a special guest and he did this inspirational talk. And I remember thinking, what just happened? A, I was mesmerized, and B, in my mind, I didn't tell anyone, but in my mind, I said, if I ever go back to school, I'd love to study with him. And that was 2007. And then 2010, I guess my dreams came true because I had the opportunity to work with him. And I, as I was telling you earlier, I found out later that I was the first female African-American student to go through the conducting program with him. And it was a real honor. I mean, that whole program with Dr. Thomas, with Judy Bowers, Kevin Fitton, Clifford Matson, I didn't know how good I had it until I got there, and it was a blessing. It was a pivotal moment in my life, and it changed the direction of my life. And I'm so glad I made the leap because I was established in Nashville. Mm-hmm. I had tenure at my school. I owned a house, but there was something in me that wanted more. And I think it's part of my need to, or this idea of mentorship. doing it at a different scale. And so I'm so grateful that I made the leap, and I'm also so grateful that I got in.
Yeah.
So it was awesome. It was just so many people in love with the art, and I learned so much. My first year, I felt was like this, because, you know, as teachers, a lot of times we're bobbing our head, and I didn't really think of myself as a conductor until I got through that program, because it really, really pushed me, and I'm grateful. I'm grateful for him, and I'm grateful for the opportunity.
And can you tell me and tell us a little bit about, it's very interesting that you were saying that you were the first Black woman to go through the program. Tell us about your experience as a conductor of color and as a female identifying conductor as well. So what's that experience been like?
Well, I mean, it can be, if you let it, it could be intimidating. When I got there, it was predominantly men. There was one other woman there when I got there, Stephanie Cash, who is now teaching at a university in Georgia. And I'm shorter, but I'm feisty, so that's fine. But it was a little overwhelming, because at some points, we can talk about background. A lot of the conductors that came in had what they call church jobs. So they were conducting this European music and this tradition weekly. They had outside gigs they were talking about. They were at the community school. They were doing, I was a teacher who you know, I did high school teaching. I taught, I did musicals, but I really was not I guess I wasn't in the same, I felt like, path that a lot of them had been on, and I didn't have a lot of the experiences that they had. So I felt like my learning curve may have been greater, but I was ready for it. But that first year was a very, very tough year for me, because I had to transition from being in charge of the classroom to not being in charge, and also to push myself to make my conducting gesture what I was giving the ensembles, rather than verbal cues or being at the piano. And so it was a shift, but again, it was a needed shift, and I'm so grateful for it. But it was, I mean, I was surrounded by all men except for one other woman. There was, I think, 7 or 8 males in the program at the time, and me. And so it was interesting, but everyone was welcoming. You know, FSU, if nothing else, it gives you a family for life. And you can go all around the country, and you'll run into someone who went through the FSU program, and you have family. There's community. There's joint ideals and about pedagogy. And so it gave me a family. It gave me another family.
Awesome. That sounds like it was just like such a fantastic experience. And it even, you know, it's actually amazing to me that, you know, speaking of women in conducting, it's true. You got to study with a woman in your master's. You got to see Peggy Detweiler working, which is, you know, also really a fantastic, and something that you actually don't see too often, you know, with women on the collegiate level.
Mm-hmm. That's true. Level. And I will say, as I said before, it really, I think, was seeing Peggy that shifted the focus of where I wanted my career path to go. And so that was monumental as well.
And I don't know, Brittany, did you tell us how many of your professors and teachers and mentors that you had were women?
Well, growing up in, you know, K through 12, all of them were women. I had very rarely a male teacher in any subject, but especially music. Out of all my schooling, K through 12, there's only 2 male music teachers that I had. And that was in band and not in chorus.
Interesting.
Yeah. And then whenever I went to college, I went to McDaniel College in Westminster, Maryland, and both the band and the choral studies heads of those departments were female. I worked with Dr. Margaret Boudreau, who just retired this past year, and Dr. Linda Kirkpatrick. And I find it interesting that I have so many female influences in my education, and not as many male influences from teachers until I got into, you know, the professional world. It changed a little bit. So.
Wow, very interesting, very interesting. And one of the things I wanted to circle back to is in this moment that we're in now, when we are reawakening to the inequities in our country, particularly racial injustices, we are having our own reckoning even within our own profession. Can you help us unpack that a little bit? So when it comes, what can we be doing better? What should we be doing differently? What should, conductors and educators of colors be doing? What can allies be doing? Talk to us a little bit about how you're seeing this.
Oh, that's interesting, because I feel like this has been for a couple of years a passion of mine. I will just take you back to 2017, 2018 school year. We had 19 instances of racial issues on our campus. And most of them were directed to women of color, specifically African-American women and Hispanic women. So it hit me. And I spent the first day just unpacking with my students. Like, I put the baton down, put the music up, and we just kind of had a discussion about what just happened on our campus, and how that affected not only me as a woman of color, but also, as you said, some of our allies and people seeing this. One of my students I remember was a Caucasian young man who actually was one of the first on the scene to see there was hate speech posted on a student's door, was one of the first instances, and the N-word was used and other things. And so he was in tears, trying to unpack what he had just experienced, and knowing that that person was someone who actually was on his floor and he was friends with. It kind of hit him differently than, I think, just talking about issues of racism or of issues of inequity can, if you're just having a conversation about it, but it hasn't affected you personally. And so one of my hopes in this time is that we don't lose not only the momentum, but lose our feeling of empathy, and realizing that we have a voice as choral directors and as educators. I did a presentation a couple years ago on fostering diversity, and a lot of times I was getting questions of whether we should be talking about issues of diversity in our choral classroom. I was like, where else would we be talking about it? I feel like it's a part of our responsibility to address the things that are actually happening so that our teaching is relevant. And I think that, again, that goes to being educated, going out and actually finding resources, even if you don't feel like you yourself may have the answers, bringing in allies. If you're a person who is not a person of color, but you want to address this, maybe you bring in someone that is a person of color who may have gone through these experiences. This past year, I've been trying to be proactive in a couple of different facets on my own campus, in having conversations with students of color in the music program, because one of my concerns is that we get these students in the program and they can sing and they have all this natural talent that has been through improv and they've learned by ear, and then we get them there and we say, we don't want any of those skills. We don't want anything that you've just brought to the table. Now you have to do this. So we've got to figure out a way in the music community to not just go from the European model, but to realize that if we want to reach students who look other ways, we've got to think outside the box, and we've got to begin to present them with curriculum that actually includes them in the curriculum. And so I think that's one of my biggest, if you could tell, I get excited.
Girl,
I'm
yeah.
easily excitable. But I feel like, I don't want us to lose the momentum, and I don't want us to just program a spiritual at the end of a song, or program a Hispanic piece and say we've done enough. That's not enough anymore. And I hope that we as educators realize that that's not enough, and then use our position. I may not be able to reach the entire world, but I can reach my community. I can reach Westfield State. I can reach the people that I have influence on and share these ideas of diversity and initiatives, and hope that it makes a difference. So I just I'm hopeful that people realize that we can't go back. We can't go back to
Absolutely.
just putting something there and saying, I've done my diversity quota for 2 to 3 years. That's not enough. And again, I see these Black and brown students in my classroom. And, you know, that's one of the things I've been actively recruiting students of color into my program. And, you know, I've had discussions with them, and a lot of times some of their experiences, you know, I love music, or I used to before I got here, but now I don't feel like I have a place. So I feel like that idea of mentorship and kind of changing our curriculum to fit now, I think would be a start.
There was a question just now on YouTube that is connecting to this specific topic. It says, if you find yourself in a predominantly non-color music program, what do you do?
I still think that you need to begin. I mean, you can begin by programming. I talked about a lot of this in a presentation I did. Begin by programming music by people from diverse backgrounds. That could be ethnic, that could be socioeconomic. It can mean identity. It could be a lot of different things. But if you know that you're not comfortable, bring other people in. Like I just did a piece, an Indian piece. I have not been to India, nor do I speak the language, but I reached out to my campus community. You could reach out to your community at large. And I found a person who spoke the language, who knew the song in its native form. She actually did speaking tracks for us. She came and presented to the class. So there's things that you can do. You don't have to be in the community to appreciate. And I think that's something that we have to remember. Part of our, I feel like part of our onus in education is that we have to make sure that we're presenting a lot of things to our students to broaden their education, even if they're not from this background, to give them an appreciation and a context for various art forms. So I think that's part of it.
That makes a lot of sense too. And I also think that as we, because, you know, we have so few, unfortunately, music educators of color, we need to bring more people into higher education and to be studying music on a collegiate level. And so we need to reform the systems. And every time I have the opportunity, if you are someone who is watching today and you want to know how can I be an ally, look at prejudicial practices within your audition requirements, because that sometimes is part of it. Like, are you allowed to sing spirituals? Is spiritual part of English as part of your English language piece? I definitely think what you were saying about we've got so many phenomenally gifted Black and brown musicians who have incredible improvisation skills, fantastic ears, that we're training people to have ears like folks might naturally have or might have developed through their experiences, through their cultural experiences and their cultural upbringings have developed them, but there's no way to demonstrate that. So it's like, okay, here's a piece of music. Can you read it? No. Well, you know, maybe, you know, here's the score. But if we could somehow also have a more encompassing evaluation and inventory of musical abilities, I think that would be just super helpful and encourage more people to apply, more of all people to apply. So that would be something I would encourage folks to do. One thing that I want to kind of talk a little bit about is we are now sometimes hesitant to do gospel or spirituals because folks are now like, oh my God, I've programmed that spiritual at the end of the concert. I'm a terrible person. I am part of the problem. I'm putting it away. I shouldn't be doing this piece. It's not good. Talk to us about that idea and help us you unpack a little bit of this kind of pendulum of where we are kind of swinging.
I think one of the first things, and this is something that I address in my book, is that we have to approach the music just like we would approach any other style of music. So when we approach a piece that is in French, we do the research, we do the performance practice, we look up the diction, we do all of these things to prepare ourselves so that we can give the most authentic performance to representative of that work. I think sometimes people either overthink or they underthink. Either they go in with it and say, I just want to do a spiritual, but have done no preparation, have done no research, have done no background on performance practice, and perform it in all various ways, which we don't necessarily have to get into right now, but perform it just to say that I have it on the program, or I want a fast closer, when sometimes they're not even fast. So, you know, not knowing about it, or we overthink it and don't want to even approach it, and then take the literature out of the experience for our students. So I think the fine line is making sure that you, as the educator and as the conductor and teacher, that you do your research, that you actually take the time and learn about the performance practice, and that you share that not only with your students, but you share that with your audience. I use it as an example all the time. I have done that piece by David Fanshawe. He's done the African Sanctus, and one of my favorite movements is the Kyrie, the second movement, which mixes the Kyrie from a Catholic Latin Mass with the Muslim call of prayer. Now, I'm neither Catholic nor Muslim. And so for me, the first place to start was with, because it's a song of faith, was with the faith. So I met with a priest. I met with an imam, and I actually talked about how the text would be used originally. What could we do with that? And I met with them. Then I actually had them come to my class about 5 or so rehearsals in, and actually talk through with the students where this would be used, why this is significant, and what part of their own traditions it would be a part of. And then I did it again for the audience. So I think it's a layering, not just saying, I'm going to put this here, but actually giving context to the practice, and so that we are gaining appreciation. We may not sing exactly like, the Moses Hogan Chorale, but we have tried our best to give significance to the practice, and also give our best performance, our best authentic performance.
And can you talk to us? I think that's really great with what you're saying, is that it's not enough to do your research and to do that in your own score setting preparation. It's not enough to do it for your students or your singers, but also bringing it home to the audience to close that loop. Can you give us some thoughts of, like, what are some ways that you've done that? Has it been bringing in a guest speaker? Has it been through program notes? Like, what are some ways that we can close that circuit?
I will say, well, I am a big fan of program notes. So any concert that you go with me, go to that I'm conducting, you're going to have thorough notes. I usually try to highlight composers that maybe people have never heard of. So 2 or 3 notes on composers. I do either significant pieces, you'll have all of the translations. So anything that's in another language, you'll always have the translations. And then other times I've done things like a lecture series, where there was a mini lecture actually before a concert. That year that we had so much social unrest on our campus, I mean, we had 19 instances from September to October. And at one point, the police, there was a lot of unrest. There were 2 things I did. I actually did a collaboration with a fellow artist on campus who is a visual artist, and we did a collaboration between art and music. And then at the end of the year, my concert, I made all about social justice. And I kind of took us through the levels of pain, through healing and restoration. And then I had no talking. I actually created a video going on behind. So we had introductions, but they were none done by us in person. And then at the end, we chose to raise money for something in our community where we could actually see impact. So we chose to give our money to the homeless shelter that year. But I think there's a lot of ways that you can tie in and layer what you're doing in the classroom so that it reaches your community and affects other people outside of the classroom walls.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. Now, you were talking a bit about performance practice as it relates to the spirituals in there. So this is something that your book is about. Can you tell us, what is this book? What is it all about? And when can we get it?
Okay. So thank you for that. The book is called A New Perspective of the Use of Dialect in African-American Spirituals. And it is history, context, which we've been talking about, and linguistics. And so this has been this is my dissertation work, and I have continued working on this project for the past 6 years. And so this has been a large portion of my research interest, and specifically the area of dialect, which I think throws people off, African Americans, non-African Americans, whether to approach the literature at all, what they should do with the dialect as it is reflected or not reflected in the score. And so these are some of the things I wanted to address in the book. And so I actually start with the language. I start with AAE dialect. I start with the sociolinguistics aspect that there is a negative connotation that has been associated with the dialect because of its descendants and because of its connection to slavery. And I even address in the book talking about the idea of the minstrel show and how the dialect was used, and it was weaponized purposefully and made fun of. And that is why there are so many mixed emotions just around the dialect. So I start with the dialect itself. And then what I wanted to do with this book is to establish what the early performance practice was. So of course you have to start with James Weldon Johnson. But then I went into early researchers. Some people I had not heard of when I started my research, Natalie Curtis Berlin, who was a Caucasian woman who dedicated her life really researching the music of people of color. She started out with Native Americans, but then ended up talking about African Americans, and even went to the continent of Africa itself. And so I start with the researchers, and then I go into early arrangers of spirituals, and I look how they actually set dialect in their songs, and I kind of go through the use of dialect that way. And the third way that I analyzed it was through sound. And so some of the earliest recordings I found at the Library of Congress were 1893, and I listened to HBCU, I listened to Fisk Jubilee Singers, Tuskegee Institute, Hampton Institute recordings, early quartets. And then I also looked at, there were several research studies that were done at the turn of the century that were sponsored by the Library of Congress. And some of those were just church services that were recorded and interviews that were done and people singing on their porch. And so I did a sound analysis as well. And what I wanted to provide for teachers was what the early practice was. What was actually happening in early practice, looking at those three things. And so then after looking at those, I solidified some of the salient features of AAE, African American vernacular. That's what it's called. So just for a linguist, I looked at those principles that were done over and over again, that continue to repeat themselves in scores, in sound recordings. And I made a list, and I compiled a list of that. And then I give teachers a way to apply it. So I see how you can apply it to scores that maybe have it and those who do not. One of the other things that I thought was significant or was important for me as an educator was to make sure that the information was provided using IPA, which is of course the International Phonetic Alphabet, so that teachers had clarification, because often when you look at early scores, sometimes the duh could be UH, sometimes it's AH, and you want to know how you should pronounce it. And so that's one of the reasons that my information I have provided in IPA. And so I give the teachers an IPA kind of a chart of vowels, of consonants, and then of practice. Like I know last week, Dr. Thomas was talking about the TH not being it in early, in the African language. And so it was modified to a D. Other things like talkin', not talking, the NG was often changed or dropped to an N. And so things of that nature. And there's a list of consonant as well as vowel rules that I give, and then I show teachers how to apply it. And the book ends with some interviews from some of our leading arrangers, including Dr. Thomas and Rollo Dilworth and Robert Morris and others, just getting insight from them on how they actually approach their own music, and insight about what they feel about the use of dialect in performance practice today. And so my hope is that with this information, teachers have a resource that they can go to and use and help inform their current practice.
This book is going to be just, I can't wait. When's it coming out?
It's coming out in October. And actually, I will say this, the book that I just described, this really massive work, which has, again, the history, the context, and linguistics, is coming out with Roman and Littlefield in October. And then I actually am going to have a companion guide with that for teachers that are going to give additional text. So like Joshua Fit the Battle of Jericho, I actually go through and show you examples of how it was used, give you different arrangements, and then give you clues of what you could do for the dialect.
So it's kind of like the, and these are for common texts that you would see in spirituals. So it's kind of like the Jeffers of spirituals, if you will. So for those who are watching, we all have the red, the green, all of the French, Latin, all of that. So when I come to your office, I better see this new one, this companion on your shelf, or I'm going to tell. All right. Now I have a couple questions. I have some questions. Can you help us understand when, and Dr. Thomas alluded this to as well, in indigenous African languages, what were some of the sounds that that did not translate over to English that we should be kind of aware to us? What are the low-hanging fruits for conductors?
I will say, in general, AAE dialect representative is a softening of English. And there's a couple of things that people need to consider when we talk about the acquisition of the language, which is something I address in the book. It's not only that they didn't have some sounds in their original languages, not language, but languages. It was also who taught them. So the influence of the Southern dialect and Appalachian dialect on AAE is, I show the correlations in my book. It's very, very close. There's a lot of things, including, the use of R. R is always either going to be a schwa sound or it's going to be deleted if it's within or at the end of a word. If it's at the beginning of a word, that's a different instance. But in the middle and ends of words, it's going to be deleted or it's going to be put into a schwa. Anything that a lot of times has a double ending. So for instance, double consonant ending. For instance, hand, we would say in English, would become hand. They soften the ending. So a lot of times there is a consonant deletion in the medial position or in the middle of a word, and also in the final position at the end of a word. So there's things like that. I already talked about the NG. Another big thing with vowels, and this is something that we address in choirs all the time, is like, don't sing a diphthong. Well, with African American English, don't sing a diphthong. So diphthongs become monophthongs, and that's why we don't have my, we have ma. And it ends there. So a lot of these things I address, these are just some of them that I address. But again, I address not everything that's in AAE dialect, but I address those things that I consistently saw repeated through my research, so that it gives, again, educators insight into that. So that's some of it. The acquisition of the language, the influence of who taught us, and what was, I talk about this too, just realize, as of the 1910 census, 90% of African Americans still lived in the South. That is why we still have such a connection to the AAE dialect, and which translated into, you can call it urban Ebonics, and has migrated into other things. But up until the 1900s, we were predominantly in a concentrated area. And that's why, again, that dialect is so strong and has lived and has been passed down. So those are some things to consider.
T's. Talk to us about T's. This is one. Tell us about those T's.
So I would say, again, softening of the T's, a lot of times becoming almost like a D. I say a dry D instead of, but it's not a hard T. And so the T's, the double D's, everything is softened, and consonants, especially if they are doubled, you're going to go with probably only one of those consonants if there's a consonant cluster.
And sometimes you see in spirituals, I'm thinking of a specific kind of arrangement. Arrangement might also differ sometimes. Like if you think about like the Hall Johnson setting of like Witness, who be a witness for my Lord. But if you look at kind of the Stacy Gibbs, it's like, who will be a witness? So it's like a completely different thing. So help me understand it.
So that's another reason why I wanted to have a discussion with the arrangers, because another thing that we have on top of all of those rules with the AAE is we have to consider the arranger's arrangement. And a lot of times they will even change words. That's why you have Joshua fought and Joshua fit, because they were trying to fit in a rhythm, or they were actually trying to fit the words into their musical idea. So that's the same thing with Moses Hogan and Battle of Jericho, where he wanted those T's pronounced to show the rhythm. So arrangers get a chance to make those choices as well and kind of play around with it. But I try to give just general rules that would cover. But that's one of the things that you have to consider is the arranger's actual arrangement and how the words that they use to fit their rhythm or their arrangement.
And if you don't know what you should be doing or what the arranger's intent is, and you might not be able to contact them, what sort of suggestions do you have for us?
So I believe that there needs to be some sound. There has to be some. I think Dr. Thomas talks about flavoring. I do think that dialect usage should be used. But again, I do think a lot of modern arrangers have chosen not to use dialect because they don't want it in, rhythmically, or they have made decisions where they don't want it in. So I think you have to be careful. But I often will soften things, even in modern arrangements. Sometimes I'll soften the TH, or I'll soften that hand to hand so that it sounds softer at the ending. So those are some things that I do if it's a living composer. If it's not a living composer, again, in the book I address, like, if dialect is there, this is what it translates, give you an idea of what it translates to. And then if it's not, one of the things that I found was so interesting, and again, I'd have to do further research, but around 1960, dialect reflection in scores dropped tremendously. Prior to 1960, you could see dialect reflection through most of the arrangers, and a lot of times there was a lot of dialect reflected. And then suddenly, and I think it's in correspondence with the civil rights movement, I have no proof of this other than my own just researching and looking, but suddenly there was no dialect, and it was kind of like we went the other extreme. And so I guess moderation is what I would say, but use research. Don't just put something in because you think it sounds that way. This book is showing you this is what early practice is. So don't do it just because I want to add something here. Was this something that was a part of practice? And that's what I would suggest for teachers and educators.
Awesome. And it's very interesting about the practice about people getting away from putting in dialect. I'm very curious what caused that. I wonder if there was just kind of because of perhaps it's not lost on me that is happening during the time of the civil rights movement, and perhaps people were thinking of like trying to be perceived. I don't know, maybe people were I'm trying to understand, why did that stop? Did it have to do with not being wanting to be made a stereotype or a trope, or like what created that?
I think it's exactly what you said. I think it is the perception of the dialect. And again, that's why my very first chapter is the perception of the dialect. Before I even start talking about what I found, I talk about the perception and the connotations that have been associated with, because that is something that has been generational. And it is something that we're still dealing with today. Because, if you think about it, like I said, the dialect has been weaponized as an agent to use in racism. And so for, some African Americans, they may feel uncomfortable with the dialect itself. And that's another reason that I came from it with a linguistic lens. I took the extra linguistic classes so that I could say, in linguistics, all language is equal. there's no hierarchy in linguistics. And that's what I start the book with. And so we have to take off this lens of lesser than or inferior, because I'm going to tell you, doing my research, a lot of the books, and some of them were, most of them were collected, even the earliest book, which I was going to mention later, one of the resources, Slave Songs of the United States. In the preface, you have all of this, you have this dialogue about how the language is inferior, how it's broken, all of these negative connotations, but yet here's the work. And so it's because it has this negative connotation associated with the dialect that there is a perception that it is less than. But we live in a culture that's a dominant language ideology, which I talk about as well, which is that standard English is number one, and everything else then is inferior. Any other language is inferior. Any other dialect is inferior. And in linguistics, that is a false statement. And so I feel like as educators, we have to address this through education and through the linguistic lens, so that we can change minds. You know, I mean, it's heavy just before we can even get into the music.
Yes, I'm even thinking, how do you fight these perceptions? Like, what do you do? And obviously this needs to be tiered based on if you're teaching college or elementary school, but what do you do to fight this perception? Like, what do you do? Because I mean, it is everywhere.
Everywhere. You have to have a dialogue, and you have to identify it. Just like I talked about, you know, you have to identify that this goes into systems. This has been a part of our language system. And this is something, you know, that even in school, if you think of in school curriculum, where they talk about the use of ebonics in curriculum and all of these things, there is a system that says that standard American English is number one, and then everything else, any other dialect or any other form of English, is inferior. When in language and linguistics, it says that we are all equal, they're all accomplishing the same thing. And so I think that if you don't address it, you have missed a part, you've missed a teaching opportunity, but you've missed a part of the context. And I think you have to address that with your students as well.
That's great. I have another question for you, which is, do you have your students write in like the dialect in their scores? If it's not already in, like, do you kind of have them write that in? Do they use IPA? Like, how do you approach that?
I do, just like I do with any other song. Again, I usually provide them with an IPA of what I want them to do and what I want them to add. With a dialect, I address it the same way. And for me, I know what the early practice is. So a lot of times I will apply early practice. I will say in the last 10 years, I have noted a change and a shift in modern arrangers where they're throwing one or two words. They'll have 2 or 3 words in, or they'll have the TH to duh, or they'll change most of the time the NG to the N a lot of times. So we've kind of seen now a sway back to starting to add dialect reflection. But again, I feel like it's for me, I feel like it's a part of the practice. And so I'm not saying I add everything in every single song, but there are times where I always do the monophthong instead of a diphthong. I usually always change the TH to the D. The consonant clusters at the end, I usually will always soften those. So I have made a choice to use early practice on a lot of these even modern arrangements. And that again was my choice as a conductor and as a researcher, because I've done the research. But again, I don't just throw anything on. I throw those things that I saw consistently used.
This is amazing. Like, this is like, yes. Can you give us any suggestions on one of the things that I think is very difficult to do is for a choir to hum, right? And so humming is very difficult. Oohing is also difficult. And we find these both in spirituals. We got a lot of humming, we got a lot of oohing, and sometimes we change our hum to ooh because it is very difficult to do that. Do you have any thoughts about how to even create in the mask those sounds of a hum, or how to ooh in the spirituals? Because it's so much a part of the repertoire. And sometimes I'm just like, oh my gosh, the hum just doesn't sound right, y'all. Like, stop it. Like, no, that's not the kind of hum. And I don't know how to quite describe it, but I feel like there is an idiomatic hum and an idiomatic ooh coloring to spirituals. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, I hadn't thought about it in that depth, but I will say that I usually think of the darker vowels or rounded vowels and then close to the M instead of just here. And I usually also will give an analogy of think of the church mother, because that's who I'm thinking of. It's not a but a You've got to have some space in there and roundness. And so usually that's how I approach it. But I do make sure that it starts with a vowel and then closes.
Awesome. I think that's a really good tip. And I've never thought about it in that way, but I think it's definitely using whatever that vowel coloring is in there to create that hum. And even that ooh, sometimes I feel like it's not necessarily a pure ooh, but it's a mix.
It's not that bright ooh. It's more of a,
Yeah. And I think that like really makes a huge difference. Like if I listen to some of the, really great recordings, I think that makes such a big difference. And I think we have a question coming in.
Yes, this is from Dr. Andre Thomas. He says, during the Harlem Renaissance, Zora Neale Hurston always wrote in dialect and refused to change her novels for publication. Langston Hughes was the opposite. Do you feel that composers or arrangers are the same?
Do I feel that
composers or arrangers are the same way?
I do think that they're the same way. And that's, I think, part of what I got out of the conversation with arrangers. Side note, hi Doc. I will say this, that was one of the things that I found interesting. And I actually talk about the Harlem Renaissance a little bit when I talk about this idea of code switching, because not only did Zora deal with this, people like Paul Laurence Dunbar is one of the ones that I use as an example, where he wrote in dialect because he embraced the dialect, but then he got pigeonholed to everything else. They didn't want him to write in standard American English. They only wanted him to write in this. So this balance of wanting to be creative and wanting to show the beauty of the dialect, as Zora did, but also wanting to do other things. And so I think that's something, this idea of code switching, that all of us as African Americans or people of color have had to do their entire lives. People will talk about, talking one way in a certain community and then talking another way in another. We've had to do that. You were raised and maybe in your family or maybe at church, you hear a certain dialect, and then at school, they want something else, or when you're teaching, they want something else. So we constantly go through this idea of code switching. And I think it's the same for composers and arrangers. And that's why I think it's, you have to look at what the arranger chose to do. And some of that is, again, influenced by the rhythms, but some have chose not to use dialect, especially some of our modern arrangers, for a specific reason. And so I think that has to be considered as well. But I do think that that's a part of the process. Do I use this? Do I show the beauty? Do I think it's beautiful? Or does it, to me, imply some of the hurt and some of the pain that's associated with the perception of the dialect? So there's a lot to it.
Now, here's a question as we get ready to close out here. If there are there a few spirituals that are not done as often that you would encourage us to make sure that we listen to while we're spending some time at home?
I'm going to do a shout out to female African-American arrangers, Undine Moore, as well as some Margaret Bond spirituals have just come back into print. I know even J.W. Pepper just is, I'm doing with the summer choir this year, Hold On, which is a Margaret Bonds that has just come back into print. But looking into Undine Moore, Florence Price, as well as Margaret Bonds, and seeing some of their works, as well as earlier arrangers, Nathaniel Dett. You should look at some of these collections, the Hampton Institute collection of spirituals. Again, there's a collection with James Rosamond Johnson and James Weldon Johnson, a collection of spirituals that are not done as much. So just looking into some of these collections and seeing some of these earlier arrangements, I would encourage. I also try to encourage people to do different periods, just like there's different periods in Western music, there's different periods in this art form. So looking at the earlier arrangements arrangers, maybe a Det or a Burley, compared to a Hall Johnson, compared to Undine Moore, compared to an Andre Thomas or a Stacey Gibbs or Rollo Dilworth. So seeing the growth of the spiritual and actually showing the differences and discussing those as well.
Awesome. I think that is really, really great. I definitely want to show some more love to our particularly Black female arrangers that some of you might know. So for those who might not have caught that, we'll definitely put those in the chat, but that's Undine Moore, Margaret Bonds, Florence Price. Those are really some great places to start from, and all of them also have works that are non-idiomatic as well that I encourage you to take a look at. And if you're a church musician, Florence Price, I certainly hope that you have the organist, her organ works, because they are truly phenomenal and just fit so well in the hands. Are there any other folks that you think we should know about? And by the way, Nathaniel Dett is amazing. If you guys don't know his works, and Ulysses K, make sure you look him up. Any other folks that?
I love Hairston. I love, of course, Dawson. I'm trying to think. No, I mean, coming up, you know, there's a lot of new arrangers, that are coming up. Brandon Waddles, Marcus Garrett. We have, trying to think of some of the newer ones. Don't forget Rosephanie Powell as another female arranger of spirituals, and she also does a lot of non-idiomatic. I would just like to leave you with a few collections just to get you started. If you're interested in spirituals, because one of the things that I think that we forget about is looking at things in its purest form. So Slave Songs of the United States has 156 of the spirituals that were collected from plantations in their song melodies. So you get just the actual melody before what we think of as the traditional concert spiritual. And then some of these collections that I mentioned are religious folk songs of the Negro from Hampton Institute. There's several versions of that. There's a collection by Fisk Jubilee. Also the James Weldon Johnson collection. There's also a work collection of spirituals as well. And then other resources. There are several resources and kind of indexes out there. I'm thinking of Eileen Davidson and others, but there's one by, I just went to Center for Black Music Research, has this fabulous index out, Index of Negro Spirituals, which is another really great resource for educators to kind of figure out if they love Margaret Bonds. You can find out what she did, whether it's spirituals or something else in another format, but you can see what spiritual she did, what's available, what's in print. And so I think that's a place to start.
Awesome. These are great resources. We will definitely be putting, going back and putting some links here. This has been a absolute pleasure. I am like, I need like 3 more hours. Oh my God. This has just been such a pleasure. I'm sure there are so many folks that are tuning in that might feel like, oh my gosh, this is overwhelming, but you have to just pick a place and start. Just choose a piece and just pick a place and start. Thank you so much again for joining us today. If folks have questions or want to reach out to you, how can they do that?
You can reach me. I'll make sure that my information for my email is available. I don't have a website. Also you can look at the resources. I didn't give a shout out to Massachusetts ACDA. I actually just became president last week. I'm very excited. And so we've got, we're going to have a lot of different diversity initiatives happening there as well. But just check out my email, send me an email. I always send resources back. I love doing, clinics. I've spoken to, as I said earlier this spring, a lot of teachers and even classrooms virtually. So I'm very passionate about this music, and I really thank you for the opportunity to share my love of the spiritual. And I'm hopeful that my book will be a help and hopefully some guiding practice to teachers and performers.
Thank you. And before we go, I would be remiss if I didn't say, talk to us quickly about the importance of representation.
Oh, yes, we didn't get to that. one of the things that I'm really also passionate about is this idea of mentorship. This idea of making sure that Black and Brown voices are heard and that they are represented. I think one thing that you touched on earlier was really key. I'm passionate. I teach right now primarily undergraduate students. So I want to not only recruit these students into my program, but I want to figure out ways that I can help them be successful so that they complete the program, so that they go out into the field and become educators. And then I was thinking next steps. Can we have a mentorship program so that we are bringing them through and becoming doctors, and so that they are at these universities and they're representing? I was thinking last year was the first time that I was conducted by a female African-American conductor, and that was Rosephanie Powell at a conference. But every time I get up and I either present or I speak, I always have Black and Brown, and a lot of times young women coming up to me and just saying thank you. And I've had even some reach out to me asking for mentorship, and not necessarily African-American, Asian American, Hispanic American, because it is important to see ourselves and see the possibilities. And so this is one of the things that I'm really determined to try to use my platform in higher education, not only to reach these students, but to hopefully create another generation of students that are represented in all forms of the art, whether it's elementary, high school, at the collegiate level, in the community as a community conductor. But I want to make sure that our voices and representation is being seen and being heard. And I'm hopeful that, you know, through my little, in my little woods, no, in my little corner, that I am making an impact, because that is what my passion is, to make a positive impact of change, and to push this idea of representation and equality, I guess, across the finish line. So anyway.
Yes, I'm here for it. I'm here for it. That's anything that I can do to support your incredible work. Please let me know. We are definitely going to have you back on the show again when the book is coming out in October, to remind people that I better see it on your bookshelf. See it on your bookshelf is what I'm going to say. Otherwise, I'm going to talk about you. Right? So please make sure that you're informed. We will keep you up to date with Dr. Barber's book. It has been a true pleasure. We'll definitely, again, continue to post resources in this thread here. Thank you, Brittany, for joining us as well. And I'm just so feeling buoyed and inspired, motivated, and I'm about to pull out my IPA, and I'm going to go to town today. I'm feeling inspired. So
I love it.
Thank you so much for being so generous with your time and with your spirit. We really appreciate it. And friends, we will see you next week on our next episode of And the Beat Goes On. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.